The first thing you need to know about my son is that he doesn't blink when things get ugly. He just adjusts the focus. Right now, I'm standing on the very edge of my own driveway, my boots planted firmly on a strip of blue painter's tape that marks the border between my private property and the city of Fairview. On the other side of that line stands Kevin Doherty, the president of our Homeowners Association, and he is currently vibrating with a level of rage usually reserved for natural disasters. Behind me, the air is screaming. The sound is coming from a 10,000 lumen stadium projector rigged to the top of a rented moving van. It's slicing a hole through the suburban dark, throwing a 20-foot-high image of Kevin's own face onto a screen hanging over the public sidewalk. In the movie, the one my 15-year-old son Gabe is currently premiering for a crowd of 60 cheering teenagers and stunned neighbors, Kevin is caught in grainy night vision, prowling around our electrical transformer like a saboteur. "Turn it off, David!" Kevin howls, his voice cracking over the roar of the cooling fans. "I have an injunction! This is a violation of the aesthetic piece!" "Check the map, Kevin!" I yell back, pointing at the blue tape. "The projector is on city land. The screen is in public air. Your piece ended the second you pulled my kid's power." In the middle of this chaos, there is Gabe. He's wearing a GoPro chest rig and holding a cinema camera that costs more than my first car. He isn't yelling. He isn't even looking at Kevin. He's circling the scene like a shark, capturing the sweat on Kevin's forehead, the flickering red and blue lights of the police cruiser pulling up to the curb, and the frantic way Kevin is trying to block the projector lens with a piece of plywood. Beside him is Caitlin, the 16-year-old mastermind who wrote the script that started this war. She's holding a boom mic over the HOA president's head with the stoic grace of a statue. "Get that thing out of my face." Kevin swats at the microphone. "Careful, Mr. Doherty," Caitlin says, her voice cool and clinical. "This is a live feed. You're trending on TikTok. Try to look professional." 2 weeks ago, this was supposed to be a simple school assignment, a quiet drama about suburban isolation. I was just the supportive dad, the guy who bought the sliders and rigged the shop lights in the garage. But then Kevin issued the first fine. Then he cut the lights. Then he brought out the leaf blower at midnight. Now, we aren't making a drama anymore. We're in the middle of a Gonzo documentary about the death of a neighborhood, and the only way out is to keep the cameras rolling until the credits crawl. The police officer steps out of his car, looking from the towering projection of a screaming Kevin to the actual screaming Kevin standing in the street. He looks at me, then at the blue tape. "Sir," the officer says to Kevin, "you're obstructing the sidewalk." Gabe zooms in. I see the red REC light glowing on the side of his camera, a tiny heartbeat in the dark. I suppose I should tell you how a 10th grade English project turned into a tactical siege. It didn't start with a riot. It started with a clipboard. Today's story is from David Miller, a software engineer who thought his biggest suburban challenge would be a leaky faucet, but who instead found himself acting as the tactical commander for a teenage film crew. At the heart of the rebellion is his 15-year-old son, Gabe, a quiet but intensely focused budding filmmaker with a rare talent for finding the truth through a camera lens, even when that truth is being actively suppressed. Completing the trio is Gabe's brilliant friend Caitlin, the production's razor-sharp writer and producer, whose deep knowledge of local bylaws and guerrilla film tactics transformed a simple school assignment into a sophisticated strike against suburban tyranny. Before we dive into today's story, if you like tales like this, smash that like button now. Comment below on where you're listening from and what you would have done if you were in David's situation. Do you think Gabe and Caitlin were justified in humiliating the HOA president? I'd be interested to know what you think. But now, let's hear David's story, as told in his own words. "I never thought I'd be the kind of dad who gets into a staring contest with a man holding a clipboard. But that's what happens when your kid decides he's the next big thing in cinema." It started on a Tuesday night in the middle of a humid October. Gabe was sprawled across the living room floor, his limbs tangled like an abandoned marionette, surrounded by crumpled pages of a script that Caitlin had written. She's a quiet girl with thick glasses and a mind that seems to operate 3 steps ahead of everyone else. I've known her since she was 5, but lately, she doesn't just walk down our street. She surveys it like she's dissecting a lab specimen. "Dad, we need the garage," Gabe said, not looking up from his viewfinder. "And the driveway. And maybe the front porch. For the whole weekend." "For the school project?" I asked, leaning against the kitchen island and watching the light catch the dust motes in our perfectly beige living room. "It's not just a project, Mr. Miller," Caitlin said, pushing her glasses up her nose with clinical precision. "It's a psychodrama. It's called The Glass Suburb. It's an exploration of the fragility of the American dream and the crushing weight of aesthetic conformity." I chuckled and grabbed a beer from the fridge. "Heavy stuff for 10th grade. What do you need from me? Besides a signature on a permission slip?" Gabe stood up, his eyes bright with that intensity he gets when he's actually excited about something. A rare sight since he hit 15. "I need you to help me rig the lights. We need it to look like a movie, Dad, not a home video. Real cinematic shadows. Noir in the cul-de-sac." I'm a software engineer by trade, but I spent my 20s in a garage band that almost went somewhere. I still have the heavy-duty extension cords and a few old stage lights gathering dust in the attic. I figured, why not? It's better than him playing video games until 2 a.m. And if I'm honest, I like the idea of being the cool dad who understands the importance of a well-placed key light. On Saturday morning, we went to work. I bought him a high-end prime lens, a long-term investment, I told his mother, who rolled her eyes but didn't protest. We spent 4 hours masking the garage windows with heavy black plastic, turning the space into a void. We set up the LED panels I'd helped him order online, snaking thick orange extension cords across the concrete like neon vines. When we finally flipped the switch, the driveway was bathed in an eerie, crisp white light that made our humble split level look like a professional soundstage. "This is it," Gabe whispered, looking at the monitor. "This is the shot." I was feeling pretty good about myself. I was the supportive dad. I was the enabler of art. I stood on the porch with a tray of sliders for the crew, which consisted of 2 other kids from the AV club, watching Caitlin direct Gabe through a tense dialogue scene about suburban isolation. She had him standing under a single, harsh spotlight in the driveway, looking up at the house as if it were a prison. Then I saw him. Kevin Doherty was standing on the sidewalk at the exact edge of our lawn, the invisible line where the HOA's jurisdiction meets the city's concrete. Kevin is the president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, a man whose primary hobby is measuring the height of people's mailboxes and ensuring that sunset beige is the only color of mulch used in a 3-mile radius. He had his silver hair slicked back and a leather-bound notebook tucked under his arm. He wasn't looking at the kids. He was looking at the light stands. He was tracking the path of the extension cords. He looked at the black plastic on the windows as if I had hung a for sale sign on the gates of heaven. He didn't say a word. He just clicked his pen, scribbled something in his book, and walked away with a stride that suggested he was already drafting a formal grievance. "Who was that?" Caitlin asked, breaking character and squinting toward the street. "Nobody," I said, though I felt a small, cold knot form in my stomach. "Just a neighbor. Keep going, guys. We're losing the light." I tried to shake it off, but later that night, the mood in the garage had changed. The excitement was still there, but it was edged with a new kind of nervous energy. Gabe was reviewing the footage, and for the first time, he wasn't just looking at the actors. He was looking at the background, checking the edges of the frame as if he expected Kevin to reappear like a ghost in the machine. "He's going to come back, isn't he?" Gabe asked, his voice quiet. I looked at the black plastic windows and the glowing LEDs. I thought about the rule book in our kitchen drawer, the one thick enough to prop up a table leg. "Let's just focus on the next scene," I said. Though I knew as well as he did that in Pine Ridge, the credits never roll without someone's permission. The crew arrived at 8 a.m. on Sunday, looking more like a tactical unit than a group of high schoolers. Along with Caitlin, there was a lanky kid named Marcus who carried a boom pole like a sacred staff, and a girl named Mia who was obsessed with continuity, which mostly meant she spent 20 minutes making sure Gabe's collar was folded exactly the same way in every shot. I was back on craft services duty. I'd set up a folding table with a coffee urn and a box of donuts, trying to keep the energy up. But every time I stepped onto the porch, my eyes drifted to the sidewalk. "He's not there, Dad," Gabe said, adjusting his tripod. He looked tired. I suspect he and Caitlin had been up half the night rereading the script or the HOA bylaws. "I'm just checking the weather," I lied. The morning shoot was supposed to be the climax of the scripted drama. Caitlin wanted a long, tracking shot of Gabe walking from the front door to the curb, looking back at the house with an expression of profound existential dread. It required a dolly track made of PVC pipes and several large white foam boards to bounce the morning sun. It looked professional. It also looked like a massive target. We were on take 4 when the sound of a slow-moving engine drifted down the street. It wasn't the usual hum of a neighbor heading to church. It was the low, deliberate crawl of a white SUV with the Pine Ridge HOA logo on the door. The car stopped dead center in front of our house. The window rolled down halfway. Kevin Doherty didn't get out. He just sat there, sunglasses on, staring at the PVC pipes. "Ignore him," Caitlin hissed to the crew. "Marcus, keep that mic out of the frame. Gabe, from the top. And action." Gabe started his walk. He was good. He had this way of slumping his shoulders that made him look 10 years older. But as he reached the halfway point of the driveway, Kevin leaned on his horn. A long, jarring beep shattered the silence. "Cut!" Caitlin yelled, her face turning a deep shade of red. "Are you serious?" The SUV crawled forward 5 feet, then stopped again. Kevin checked his watch, wrote something in his notebook, and finally drove off, disappearing around the corner. "He did that on purpose," Marcus said, lowering the boom pole. He waited for the slate. "He's establishing a presence," Caitlin whispered. She looked at me, her eyes sharp. "He's not trying to stop us yet. He's trying to make us stop ourselves." I felt a surge of protectiveness I hadn't felt since Gabe was in T-ball. I walked down to the edge of the driveway, right to the invisible line. I looked down the street, but Kevin was gone. "Don't let him get in your heads," I told them. "We've got 4 more hours of light. Let's get the shot." We spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of high alert. Every time a car turned onto the street, the kids froze. Mia started keeping a Doherty log on the back of her continuity sheets, marking down every time his car passed by. He did it 3 more times before noon. At 2 p.m., the first blow landed. It wasn't a horn honk or a drive-by. It was a knock at the front door. I opened it to find a young guy in a polo shirt, the HOA's compliance officer. He looked embarrassed, like he'd rather be anywhere else. He handed me a bright orange envelope. "Mr. Miller? I'm sorry about this." Mr. Doherty filed an expedited nuisance report. I opened the envelope. Inside was a printed photo of our driveway from earlier that morning. It showed the PVC tracks, the lights, and the kids. At the bottom, in bold red letters, it cited Section 8.4, Obstruction of Aesthetic Uniformity, and Section 12.1, Unpermitted Professional Activity in a Residential Zone. The fine was $250 per hour of continued violation. "Professional activity?" I snapped. "He's 15. It's for English class." "I just deliver the notices, sir," the guy said, backing away toward his golf cart. Gabe and Caitlin were standing behind me in the foyer. They saw the orange paper. They saw the price tag. The air seemed to go out of the room. "That's my camera lens," Gabe whispered. "The fine is more than the equipment." I looked at the kids, then at the orange slip, then out at the street where Kevin's SUV was parked 3 houses down, just watching. "Pack it up," I said quietly. "Dad?" Gabe looked crushed. "I didn't say we were quitting," I said, a slow heat rising in my chest. I said, "Pack it up. We're moving the set." The moving the set part sounded a lot more heroic than it actually felt. In reality, it was a frantic, sweaty scramble to drag heavy light stands and PVC pipes into the garage before Kevin could snap another photo. We looked like we were hiding contraband. Once the garage door rattled shut, the silence was heavy. The kids sat on the concrete, surrounded by the tangled remains of their professional set. The high-end lens I'd bought Gabe sat on a workbench, reflecting the dull glow of a single overhead bulb. "We can't do the tracking shot in here," Gabe said, his voice flat. "The script needs space. It needs the crushing weight of the suburb. You can't see the suburb through a closed garage door." Caitlin was sitting on a stack of tires, her laptop open. She wasn't looking at the script. She was looking at the orange envelope I'd tossed on the table. "He called it professional activity," she whispered. "He's using the law to define our art as a business so he can tax it out of existence." "It's just a bully tactic, Caitlin," I said, trying to sound like the adult in the room. "I'll call the board tomorrow. We'll explain the school assignment." "No," Gabe said suddenly. He stood up and grabbed his camera, but he didn't put it on the tripod. He stripped off the cinematic filters in the matte box. He held it bare, just the body and the lens. "He's right. It is professional. We're documenting a hostile environment." He turned the camera on me. "Dad, sit down. Right there under the work light." "Gabe, I'm not in the movie," I protested. "You're in this one," he said. "Caitlin, forget the script. Give me the compliance file. Caitlin's eyes lit up. She realized what he was doing before I did. She handed him the orange envelope. Gabe held it in front of the lens for a 3-second count, then panned up to my face. "Okay, Dad," Gabe said, his voice steadier than I'd heard it all day. "Tell the camera what the officer said. Tell us how much the fine is." I looked at the lens. I felt ridiculous for a second. Then I looked at the garage door. The only thing separating my son's creativity from a man with a notebook and a grudge. The supporting dad persona fell away, replaced by something a bit more jagged. "The fine is $250, I said, leaning into the light. "Per hour. Because apparently, teenagers making a movie is a nuisance to the aesthetic of Pine Ridge. Kevin Doherty thinks our driveway is a crime scene." "Great," Caitlin whispered. "Now tell us about the navigational hazard." For the next hour, the garage became a different kind of studio. There was no blocking, no continuity, and no sliders. Gabe filmed Marcus holding the boom pole like a weapon of war. He filmed Mia crying, not for a scene, but because she was actually stressed about the fine. He filmed the black plastic we'd ripped off the windows. It was messy. It was raw. It felt like the behind-the-scenes footage of a disaster, which, according to Gabe, was exactly the point. "We're going to include the drama scenes we already shot," Gabe explained, showing me a playback of the polished, moody footage from yesterday contrasted with the shaky, handheld shot of the HOA SUV. "The Glass Suburb is still there. It's just being shattered in real time." I watched the screen. The transition from the beautiful, cinematic world they had imagined to the cold, harsh reality of the garage was jarring. It was powerful. "What's the plan?" I asked. "We need more footage of Kevin," Caitlin said, her glasses reflecting the monitor. "If he wants to monitor us, we're going to monitor him. We're going to film the aesthetic uniformity of this place until it looks like a horror movie." I looked at my son. He looked like he'd just found his mission. "I have a property survey in the office," I said, a slow grin forming. "If we're going to do this, we need to know exactly where his power ends and the city of Fairview begins." Gabe hit the record button again. Chapter 3, The Border Survey. "Go get the map, Dad." Monday morning brought a different kind of silence. The kids were at school, and I was sitting in my home office, supposedly coding, but mostly I was staring at the property survey spread out across my desk. I had highlighted the property line in neon yellow. Our driveway was ours, but the first 6 feet of grass near the curb? That was a utility easement. The sidewalk? City property. I was interrupted by a text from Gabe. "Check the driveway. He's back." I looked at the feed from our doorbell camera. There was Kevin, standing on the sidewalk. He wasn't just looking today. He was using a rolling measuring wheel to check the distance from our front door to the spot where the PVC tracks had been. He looked like a man preparing for a court case. When Gabe and Caitlin got home at 3:30, they didn't even drop their bags. They went straight to the garage. "We saw him on the way in," Gabe said, his face flushed. "He was taking photos of the dead patch of grass where the light stand sat for 4 hours. He's building a file, Dad." "Let him," Caitlin said. She looked energized. She had a stack of library books on guerrilla filmmaking and a legal pad filled with notes. "We don't need the driveway anymore. We're going to film him filming us." The border war began at 4 p.m. I helped them haul a single chair and a tripod to the very edge of the lawn, specifically 6 inches onto the city-owned sidewalk. Gabe sat in the chair with the camera aimed directly down the street toward Kevin's house. Caitlin stood next to him with the boom mic, held high like a flag. "You're sure about the line?" Gabe asked me. "I measured it twice," I said, leaning against our mailbox. "As long as that tripod leg stays on the concrete, he can't touch you." It took exactly 10 minutes for the white SUV to appear. It crawled around the corner, engine purring. Kevin saw the setup and slowed to a halt. He rolled down his window, but this time, Gabe didn't flinch. He hit the record button and zoomed in. "You're obstructing the walkway," Kevin yelled from the car. "Actually, Kevin," I called out, feeling a rush of adrenaline that was probably immature for a 40-year-old. "The city ordinance requires a 4-foot clearance for pedestrians. We've left 5. We checked." Kevin's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. He stepped out of the car, his notebook gripped so tight his knuckles were white. "This is a private community. You are creating a visual disturbance." "I'm filming a documentary about public spaces," Gabe said, his voice remarkably calm. "You're a public figure in this neighborhood, Mr. Doherty. Would you like to give us a statement on your aesthetic uniformity policy? Caitlin swung the boom mic closer to Kevin's face. The fuzzy wind cover on the mic was practically brushing his nose. Get that thing out of my face, Kevin snapped, swatting at the air. Careful, Kevin, I said. That's expensive equipment. If you break it, we'll have to add property damage to the documentary. Kevin realized he was being baited. He looked at the camera lens, that big glass eye recording his every twitch, and he saw the neighbors starting to peek out from their curtains. He was losing the dignity he worked so hard to maintain. He retreated to his SUV without another word, but the way he slammed the door told us this wasn't over. Did you get it? Caitlin asked. Gabe looked at the monitor, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. I got the sweat on his forehead. It's perfect. It makes the drama scenes look like a dream, and this looks like a nightmare. He flipped the screen around to show us. The footage was raw and shaky, a stark contrast to the polished Glass Suburb clips. It felt like we were watching a news report from a front line. What's next? I asked. Night shots, Gabe said. We need to see what this place looks like when the Aesthetic Uniformity Committee is asleep. I looked at my son and realized he wasn't just making a movie anymore. He was conducting a siege. The kitchen had officially transformed into a war room by midnight. The air was thick with the smell of burnt popcorn, stale coffee, and the kind of frantic energy that only exists when teenagers discover a cause worth losing sleep over. Gabe and Caitlin were hunched over the laptop, the blue light of the editing software washing their faces in a ghostly, digital glow. I'd come down for a glass of water, but the sight of them stopped me at the threshold. They weren't just editing a school project. They were analyzing a tactical failure. You guys need to close the laptops, I said, leaning against the counter. School starts in 7 hours, and you both look like extras from a zombie flick. We can't stop yet, Dad, Gabe said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. Look at this transition. Just watch. He hit the spacebar. The screen was split. On the left was the footage from Friday, the scripted world. It was beautiful. Caitlin's character was standing by the window, the lens flare catching her hair perfectly as she looked out at the neighborhood with a look of poetic, cinematic longing. It was the Glass Suburb they had imagined. Then, with a jagged, glitchy cut, the right side of the screen took over. It was the raw, handheld footage from that afternoon. The frame shook violently as Kevin Doherty's white SUV lunged into view. You could hear the shrill, distorted blast of his horn, followed by his muffled shouting through the glass. The contrast was visceral. It felt like watching a dream get hit by a freight train. It's not a drama anymore, Caitlin said, turning in her chair. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot behind her glasses. We talked about it on the bus. We're pivoting. We're calling the movie The Board. It's a Gonzo documentary about the death of the original film. It's about the struggle to create art in a place where the grass is legally required to be silent. I like the angle, I said, pulling up a chair. But you know Kevin isn't just going to sit there and be your villain. He's a man who treats the HOA bylaws like the Ten Commandments. He's going to escalate. Let him, Gabe said, pointing at a stack of papers next to the laptop. Caitlin didn't just look up camera angles in the library today. She looked up the HOA's founding charter from 1988. Caitlin tapped a highlighted paragraph on a photocopied sheet. Section 14.3, the right to peaceful assembly. Kevin uses the quiet enjoyment clause to stop us from filming because he says we're a nuisance. But the city of Fairview's charter says the sidewalk is a public forum. The two laws are literally touching each other at the end of our driveway. It's a jurisdictional fault line. A border war, I muttered, looking at the map. Exactly, Gabe said. He clicked on a new file. It was the blackout footage from the night Kevin pulled the power for his emergency inspection. Gabe hadn't stopped recording when the lights went out. The footage was grainy, green, and shot in night vision. You could see the silhouette of Kevin standing by the green transformer box at the edge of the yard, looking like a suburban saboteur. This is the heart of the new movie, Gabe said, his voice gaining strength. The moment the lights go out, we're going to use the audio from Caitlin's original script, the lines about the walls closing in, and play them over this footage of Kevin actually shutting down our world. It turns the fiction into a reality. I looked at my son. He wasn't the quiet kid who stayed in his room playing games anymore. He had found a lens, and through it, he had found a spine. He was a journalist covering a conflict in his own front yard. and he was realizing that the more Kevin fought him, the better the movie became. "What do you need from me?" I asked, realizing my supportive dad role was about to get a lot more complicated. "We need to go deeper," Caitlin said. "We're going to set up a permanent press area on the sidewalk tomorrow. We aren't going to hide in the garage. We're going to be out there, in the open, with the camera running. We're going to see what happens when we don't blink." I looked at the clock, then at the property survey. "Get some sleep," I said. "If we're going to hold a line tomorrow, you're going to need your eyes sharp. And I'm going to need to find where I put those battery-powered stage floods." As they headed upstairs, I stayed in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the dark street through the window. I knew Kevin was out there, somewhere, probably drafting a new list of violations. But for the first time, I wasn't worried about the fines. I was wondering if we had enough memory cards. Tuesday afternoon was when the border war officially graduated from a neighborhood spat to a full-blown tactical siege. I spent my lunch break in the garage with a roll of blue painter's tape and a printed copy of the city property survey. I knelt on the hot asphalt, marking a thin, neon blue boundary exactly where our driveway's private concrete met the public sidewalk. It was a jagged, symbolic line, the edge of Kevin's kingdom. When Gabe and Caitlin arrived home from school, they didn't even drop their backpacks. They walked into the garage with the grim, focused energy of a news crew heading into a flashpoint. "The Gonzo unit is reporting for duty," Gabe said. He wasn't smiling. He was wearing a GoPro chest rig over his hoodie and carrying his main camera like a soldier carries a rifle. We moved our operations to the very edge of the lawn. We set up a folding card table right on that blue tape line, planting the tripod legs firmly on the city-owned concrete. I brought out a heavy-duty cooler to serve as a bench and sat there with my tablet. I was supposedly working from home, but mostly I was acting as a human shield and a legal witness. "The key is the eye contact," Caitlin told Gabe as she adjusted the boom mic's wind cover. "If he comes out, don't look at him. Look at the viewfinder. He's a man who lives for recognition and authority. If you treat him like a specimen instead of a president, he'll lose his mind." It took exactly 14 minutes for the white SUV to emerge from Kevin's driveway 3 houses down. He didn't drive it over this time. He parked it and walked the rest of the way, his leather-bound notebook clutched to his chest like a breastplate. He stopped exactly 3 inches short of our blue tape line, his polished loafers hovering at the edge of the public sidewalk. "David," he said, his voice tight, vibrating with a kind of controlled fury that made the air feel thin. "This has gone beyond a school project. This is a deliberate, calculated provocation. You are harboring a multi-person production crew on a public thoroughfare and creating a visual blight for every resident in this circle." "It's a sidewalk, Kevin," I said, not looking up from my screen. I made a show of scrolling through a spreadsheet. My son is a student journalist documenting the sociology of suburban life. And as you can see by the tape, he's on city property. If you have a problem with the sidewalk, you'll have to call the mayor's office. I believe their hold music is quite lovely. Kevin turned his gaze to Gabe, who was standing behind the camera. "You think you're being clever, Gabriel? You think these little loopholes protect you? But I've already contacted the HOA's legal counsel. We are looking into harassment charges and unauthorized surveillance of private citizens. You are filming residents without their express written consent." Gabe didn't flinch. He didn't even speak. He just slowly reached out and twisted the focus ring on the lens, pulling the shot tight until the screen was filled with nothing but Kevin's twitching left eye and the sweat beads forming on his upper lip. On the monitor, the detail was brutal. The high-definition reality of a man losing his grip on a situation. "He's not answering you, Mr. Doherty," Caitlin said, her voice cool, echoing that professional, detached tone you hear on the nightly news. "He's in the zone. But as the producer, I can provide you with a press release. We're currently filming a segment titled The Architect of Conformity. Would you like to provide a comment on the record regarding the $250 fine you issued for aesthetic non-uniformity?" Kevin's face went from a dull red to a terrifying, ghostly white. He looked at the camera, then at me, then at the neighbors' houses. He could see Mrs. Gable across the street, who was watering her roses with a suspicious level of intensity, and the Miller twins next door, who were watching the whole thing from their bedroom window. The aesthetic uniformity he spent his life protecting was being replaced by a very public, very messy drama. "This is your last warning," Kevin hissed, leaning over the line just enough for his shadow to touch my shoes. "The board is holding an emergency executive session tonight. We will be voting on a special assessment for this property, nuisance mitigation. It starts at $500, and it compounds daily until the obstruction is removed. I'll be sure to add it to the production costs section of the credits, I said, finally looking him in the eye. Kevin spun on his heel and marched back toward his house, his notebook flapping against his side. The moment his back was turned, Gabe kept the camera rolling, capturing the stiff, angry retreat of the man who thought he owned the very air we breathed. "We got the special assessment thread on the boom mic," Caitlin whispered, pulling her headphones down. "Crystal clear. It's perfect. It's the classic villain tries to bankrupt the hero trope. It gives the documentary a ticking clock." "He's not bluffing about that meeting, though," I said, looking at the blue tape. "He's going to try to kill this project tonight behind closed doors." Gabe stepped away from the camera, looking at the playback of Kevin's retreating figure. He looked at the screen, then at the house, then back at me. "Let him meet," Gabe said, his voice steady. "I want to see if we can get a camera into that community center. If the movie needs a climax, a secret trial is exactly what the audience wants to see." I looked at my son and realized we weren't just defending our driveway anymore. We were going to the hearing. The guerrilla unit spent the afternoon prepping for the heist of the century, though the target wasn't a bank. It was the Pine Ridge Community Room, a space that smelled perpetually of lemon wax and broken dreams. I spent 3 hours scouring the Pine Ridge covenants while Gabe and Caitlin transformed the garage into a technical lab. We weren't just looking for film angles anymore. We were looking for a way in. "Section 22.4. I shouted from the kitchen, holding the heavy binder like a trophy. "Meetings of the board shall be open to all members, except for matters involving personnel or pending litigation." He's going to try to call this litigation to keep the doors locked. "Then we don't go in as members," Caitlin said, not looking up from a GoPro she was currently camouflaging with black gaffer tape. "We go in as the press. If the school paper assigns us to cover the meeting, and we film from the public hallway through the open doors, he can't claim trespass without a city police officer present. And Kevin hates calling the real police. It messes with the low crime statistics he brags about in the newsletter." The plan was a two-pronged entry. I would go in the front door as the homeowner, armed with a digital recorder and a printed list of grievances. Gabe and Caitlin would be the extraction team, positioned in the hallway with the long lens camera. When we arrived at the community center at 7 p.m., the parking lot was eerily quiet. Kevin's white SUV was parked crookedly across two spots right out front, a blatant violation of the very rules he'd fined us for. Gabe didn't miss it. He did a slow, dramatic pan from the SUV's logo to the no double parking sign. "Chapter 7, The Secret Trial," Gabe whispered into his chest rig mic. Inside, the air conditioning was humming at a bone-chilling 60 degrees. I walked into the meeting room and found the board. 5 people over 60, all wearing various shades of beige, sitting behind a long folding table. Kevin was in the center, his notebook open, looking like a judge at the Salem witch trials. "This is an executive session, David," Kevin said, his voice echoing in the empty room. "You were not invited." "Open meeting laws, Kevin," I said, taking a seat in the very front row. "Unless you're discussing your own resignation, I have a right to be here." I heard the heavy double doors at the back of the room creak. Gabe and Caitlin were there, silhouetted against the hallway lights. Gabe had the camera on a shoulder mount now. He didn't come inside, but the long lens was pointed directly at Kevin's face from the doorway. It looked like a sniper rifle made of glass and plastic. "Remove them," Kevin shouted, slamming his hand on the table. A glass of water rattled. "No filming is permitted in board meetings." "We're in the hallway, Mr. Doherty." Caitlin's voice drifted in, calm and hauntingly professional. "The hallway is a common area under Section 5.1. We are residents in a common area. We are merely observing." "This is an outrage," one of the other board members squeaked. Mrs. Higgins, the treasurer. She looked at the camera lens and immediately pulled her cardigan tighter, as if the camera could see through her clothes. "The motion on the table," Kevin hissed, trying to regain control, "is a special assessment of $500 per day against the Miller property for chronic aesthetic interference and unsanctioned commercial filming. Do I have a second?" The room went silent. The board members looked at Kevin. Then they looked at the camera in the doorway. They realized that every word they said was being recorded. They realized that if they voted for this, they wouldn't just be managing the neighborhood. They would be the villains in a movie that the whole high school and probably the local news would eventually see. I think we should perhaps table this," Mrs. Higgins whispered, "until we have legal counsel present." We are the council, Kevin roared. Actually, I said, standing up and pointing toward the camera, you're just the actors, and I think you're blowing your lines. Kevin looked at me, then at Gabe. The silence stretched for a long, agonizing minute. You could hear the whir of the camera's autofocus motor in the quiet room. It was the sound of Kevin's authority evaporating. He didn't call for the vote. He didn't even adjourn the meeting. He just stood up, grabbed his notebook, and walked toward the back exit. Did you get that? I asked, turning to the door. Gabe lowered the camera, his eyes wide behind the viewfinder. I got the sweat, the water glass shaking, and the look on his face when his own board bailed on him. That's the climax, Caitlin said, checking the digital file. The system breaking down in real time. I walked out of the room, leaving the rest of the board sitting in the cold, lemon-scented silence. We walked to the car in the dark, the Gonzo unit buzzing with the kind of victory that only comes from staring down a bully with a lens. But as we pulled out of the parking lot, I saw Kevin's SUV following us. He wasn't honking this time. He was just following. The drive home felt like a scene straight out of a 1970s paranoia thriller. Kevin's white SUV stayed exactly 3 car lengths behind us, his headlights burning 2 white holes into my rearview mirror. He didn't high beam us. He didn't swerve. He just sat there, a silent, motorized shadow tailing us through the winding, manicured curves of Pine Ridge. He's still there, Gabe whispered from the back seat. He was huddled over the camera, his thumb hovering near the playback button, as if he were protecting a holy relic. Don't look back, Caitlin said, though she was twisted around in her seat, her phone out, recording the SUV through the rear window. If he's trying to intimidate us, we need to document the intimidation. This is Chapter 8, the tale. I pulled into our driveway and kept the engine running for a second. Kevin didn't pull into his own driveway 3 houses down. He stopped at the curb directly in front of our house, the engine of his SUV idling with a low, menacing growl. The neighborhood was dead quiet, the streetlights casting long, amber shadows across the lawns. Everyone inside. Now, I said, my voice dropping an octave. We scrambled out of the car, hauling the gear like we were offloading supplies in a war zone. I waited until the kids were safely behind the front door before I turned back to the street. Kevin was still there. I could see the silhouette of his head through the windshield, unmoving, watching. He stayed there for 20 minutes. Inside, the kitchen had become a fortress. Gabe and Caitlin didn't even take off their coats. They went straight to the production desk. But the energy had shifted. The high of the board meeting victory had been replaced by the cold realization that Kevin wasn't just a nuisance anymore. He was obsessed. He's not going to stop at fines, is he? Gabe asked, his voice shaking slightly. He's losing his grip, Gabe, I said, leaning against the counter and watching the SUV through the blinds. When guys like Kevin lose their aesthetic uniformity, they feel like they're losing their soul. He's trying to scare us into deleting the footage. He'll have to pry this SD card out of my cold, dead hands, Caitlin muttered, but she looked pale. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sound we hadn't heard yet, the high-pitched, industrial whine of a leaf blower. I checked the clock. It was 11:30 p.m. I threw open the front door. Kevin had gotten out of his car. He had an industrial-grade, backpack-style leaf blower strapped to his shoulders. He wasn't blowing leaves. He was standing on the sidewalk, the city-owned sidewalk, and aiming the nozzle directly at our front porch, blasting air at hurricane speeds. Kevin, it's nearly midnight, I shouted over the roar. He couldn't hear me, or he didn't care. He was wearing ear protectors and a grimace of pure, unadulterated spite. He began pacing the length of our property line, the blower screaming. It was the heckler tactic taken to a psychotic extreme. He was trying to ruin the peaceful enjoyment of our home so he could claim we were the ones causing a disturbance. Record this, I yelled back into the house. Gabe appeared at the door, but he didn't have his big camera. He had his phone, and he was live streaming. We're live, Kevin, he screamed. 300 people from school are watching you blow air at a blade of grass at midnight. Say hi to the internet. Kevin froze. The mention of an audience, a real, digital audience that didn't care about HOA bylaws, seemed to snap something. He lowered the nozzle. The whine of the machine died down, leaving a ringing silence in the street. He stood there, panting, the heavy machine strapped to his back, making him look like a ridiculous suburban cyborg. He looked at Gabe's phone, then at the neighbors' windows, where lights were flicking on one by one. You're the nuisance, Kevin croaked, his voice raw from the exhaust. You're the one who brought this filth into our circle. Go home, Kevin, I said, stepping onto the grass, before I call the cops for a noise complaint. He stared at me for a long time, his chest heaving. Then, without a word, he turned, climbed back into his SUV, and drove the 50 feet to his own house. Gabe turned off the stream. His hands were trembling. Did you see his eyes, Dad? He looked broken. He's not broken, Caitlin said, looking at the footage on Gabe's phone. He's just realized he's not the director of this movie. He's just the antagonist, and he's about to do something desperate. She was right. As we went to bed, I saw a new light in Kevin's home office. He wasn't sleeping. He was typing. The following morning didn't start with a sunrise. It started with a notification chime that sounded like a death knell. By 7 a.m., my phone was buzzing so incessantly it vibrated right off the nightstand. Kevin had spent the night drafting a masterpiece of suburban propaganda. It was an emergency safety alert sent to every resident in the Pine Ridge database. The subject line read, "Critical Safety Advisory, unauthorized surveillance and aggressive conduct." I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes as I read his words. He had framed the entire saga as a coordinated harassment campaign by outside elements. He claimed Gabe and Caitlin were using high-powered surveillance equipment to record children in their yards, and that I was verbally assaulting board members. He even attached a blurry, zoomed-in photo of Gabe's long lens from the night before, making it look like a piece of military hardware. Dad? Gabe was standing in the doorway, still in his pajamas, holding his own phone. He looked smaller than he had the night before. The AV Club group chat is blowing up. Everyone saw Kevin's email. People are saying we're going to get expelled. Nobody is getting expelled for a school project, Gabe, I said, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. The pressure intensified when we pulled into the school drop-off lane. Usually, Gabe and Caitlin blended into the sea of backpacks, but today, heads were turning. I saw a group of parents huddled near the entrance, phones in hand, pointing at my car. Kevin hadn't just attacked our project, he had poisoned the well. At 10 a.m., I got the call I'd been dreading. It was the principal's office. When I arrived, I found Gabe and Caitlin already there, sitting on a wooden bench outside the office like they were waiting for a sentencing hearing. Caitlin had her laptop clutched to her chest as if it were a shield. Inside, Principal Higgins, a man who looked like he'd spent 30 years mediating playground disputes, was sitting across from a very smug, very composed Kevin Doherty. David, thank you for coming, Higgins said, gesturing to a chair. Mr. Doherty has brought some significant concerns to my attention regarding the nature of Gabriel's film assignment. It's not concerns, Arthur, Kevin interrupted, his voice smooth and rehearsed. It's a liability. These students are using school-sanctioned equipment to violate the privacy of a private community. They are creating a hostile environment. If the school doesn't intervene, the association will be forced to name the district in our upcoming litigation. The L word. Litigation. I saw Principal Higgins flinch. School administrators hate lawsuits more than they hate a broken boiler. We're not violating privacy, Principal Higgins, Caitlin said, her voice remarkably steady for a 16-year-old. We're documenting a public conflict. We have every shot logged. Every time we filmed, we were on public property or Mr. Miller's property. It's a nuisance, Kevin barked, his composure slipping for a second. You're making a mockery of our regulations. Principal, I said, leaning forward. My son had an assignment to tell a story. He started with a drama. Kevin here decided to turn it into a thriller by cutting our power and stalking us with a leaf blower at midnight. Gabe didn't create the drama. He just didn't stop the camera when the reality became more interesting than the script. Gabe looked at me, then at the principal. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small portable monitor. He plugged it into Caitlin's laptop. I'm not going to argue about the bylaws, Gabe said. I just want you to see the contrast. He hit play. He showed the Glass Suburb scene, the beautiful golden hour shot of Caitlin talking about dreams. Then he cut to the night vision footage of Kevin standing over the transformer box, his face twisted in a look of pure, petty triumph as he pulled the lever. The office went silent. Principal Higgins leaned in, his eyes widening. He watched the clip of Kevin chasing them with the leaf blower, the man's face red and distorted, looking nothing like the concerned citizen sitting in the leather chair across from him. This is highly unusual, Higgins whispered. It's Gonzo, sir, Caitlin added. The truth is often unusual. Kevin stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. This is a fabrication, a digital edit. It's a primary source, Kevin, I said. Principal Higgins looked at Kevin, then at the kids. He was a resident of a different HOA 3 towns over, and I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The universal look of a man who has also been told his mailbox was 2 inches too low. Mr. Doherty, Higgins said, his voice cold. The school does not dictate the artistic content of student projects unless they violate the code of conduct. From what I see here, the only conduct I'm concerned about isn't coming from the students. This assignment stands. We walked out of that office feeling 10 feet tall. Kevin stayed behind, his muffled shouting audible through the heavy oak door. But as we reached the parking lot, Caitlin stopped. He's not done, she said, looking at the school's front gate. He's going to try to block the premiere. If he can't stop the filming, he'll try to stop the screening. Then we won't screen it at school, Gabe said, looking at me with a wild, rebellious glint in his eye. We'll screen it where it happened, in the driveway, on the garage door. I looked at my son and knew I was about to get another orange envelope. And for the first time, I didn't care. The air in the house felt electric, a mix of high-stakes tech prep and the heavy, quiet dread that precedes a storm. We were past the point of school projects. This was a full-scale cultural insurgency. If we're doing this, we're doing it right, I said, clearing the dining room table to make room for the new equipment. I'd spent the morning at a specialized rental house downtown, coming back with a cinema-grade 10,000 lumen projector that looked like it belonged in a stadium, not a suburban garage. The garage door is the screen, Gabe said, pacing the length of the driveway with a laser measurer. We've got 80 square feet of white aluminum. It's perfect. It's a billboard for the truth. Caitlin was the one in charge of the broadcast. She wasn't just prepping the film. She was prepping the invitations. She'd bypassed the HOA email list entirely, using a geo-fenced social media ad and a series of underground flyers she'd handed out to every teenager in the district. We're calling it the final cut, she said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. And I've already sent the link to the local news consumer protection desk. If Kevin wants to stop us, he has to do it in front of a live audience. The counterattack came at 2 p.m. It wasn't a leaf blower this time. It was a black sedan parked at the curb. A man in a sharp suit, the HOA's lead attorney, stepped out holding a manila folder. He didn't go to the door. He walked straight to where I was mounting the projector on a heavy-duty scaffold. Mr. Miller, the lawyer said, his voice like cold silk. I'm here to serve you with a preliminary injunction. The association has filed for a temporary restraining order in county court. It prohibits the projection of unapproved visual media onto any exterior surface within the Pine Ridge development. I didn't take the folder. I just kept tightening the bolt on the scaffold. On what grounds? Public nuisance, light pollution, and, most importantly, the unauthorized use of the association's likeness and logo for commercial purposes, he said, dropping the folder onto my toolbox. If that projector turns on tonight, the sheriff will be here to confiscate it, and your house will be under a lien by Monday morning. He walked away, but I could see Kevin watching from his upstairs window, his silhouette framed by the curtains. He looked like a king watching a rebellion from his balcony. Dad? Gabe had heard everything. He was holding the HDMI cable like it was a piece of junk. Is it over? A lien? That's the house. That's our home. I looked at the folder, then at the massive white canvas of our garage door. Then I looked at the property survey still pinned to the wall. Caitlin, I called out. Come here. I need you to look at the wording of this injunction. She ran over and scanned the legal jargon. Her eyes narrowed. It says we can't project onto any exterior surface within the development. Exactly, I said, a slow, dangerous grin spreading across my face. It says we can't project onto the house. It doesn't say anything about the air above the house. Wait, Gabe said, his eyes widening. What are you talking about? The city-owned sidewalk, I said, and that massive white rental van I just booked. We're not going to use the garage door. We're going to park the van on the public street, hang a screen off the side of it, and project from the sidewalk. The movie won't be on the house. It'll be in the air. Kevin's rules stop at the curb. Gabe and Caitlin shared a look of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the guerrilla spirit in its purest form. "We need a bigger sound system," Gabe whispered. "I've already got the Bluetooth speakers sync-linked," I said. "We're going to make sure the back row of the neighborhood can hear every word Kevin said about filth and purity." We spent the rest of the afternoon in a fever of activity. We weren't just filmmakers anymore. We were engineers of a loophole. We moved the entire setup 3 feet forward onto the city concrete. We were standing on a tiny strip of freedom, and as the sun began to set, the first car started to pull into the street. Not the white SUVs of the HOA. These were beat-up sedans, minivans, and bikes. The audience was arriving. And across the street, I saw Kevin's front door fly open. The night of the premiere didn't just feel like a screening. It felt like the final act of a heist. The air was cool, the streetlights were humming, and the public sidewalk was packed with people who had come to see the Forbidden movie. But as the crowd grew, Gabe and Caitlin weren't sitting in lawn chairs. They were back in the Gonzo harness. "We're not just showing the movie, Dad," Gabe whispered, checking the battery levels on his chest rig. "The screening is the ending. We're filming the audience, we're filming the street, and most importantly, we're filming Kevin. This is the infinite loop cut." I stood by the massive rental van we'd parked on the city street. We had rigged a heavy, professional-grade projector screen to the side of the vehicle, facing the sidewalk. It was a massive, glowing white rectangle that sat exactly 2 inches outside the HOA's jurisdiction. I felt like a pirate captain guarding the gangplank. "Projector is hot," Caitlin called out. She hit the play button, and the 10,000 lumen beam sliced through the suburban dark. The image was massive. The first thing the neighborhood saw wasn't a school credit. It was the Glass Suburb logo, followed immediately by the raw footage of Kevin Doherty yelling about the $250 fine. The crowd erupted. A mix of teenagers and fed-up neighbors cheered as Kevin's face appeared, 20 feet tall, projected against the night sky. Then, the infinite loop began. Gabe moved through the crowd with his camera, filming people's reactions to the movie while the movie played behind them. He captured Mrs. Gable laughing as the film showed Kevin measuring her roses with a ruler. He captured the collective gasp when the blackout footage played, the grainy night vision shot of Kevin pulling the power. But the real money shot happened 10 minutes in. Kevin's front door slammed open. He didn't come out with a notebook this time. He was carrying a large, heavy piece of plywood. He ran toward the sidewalk, his face a mask of desperation, and tried to thrust the plywood in front of the projector's lens to block the image. "It's an illegal broadcast," Kevin screamed, his voice cracking. "This is a violation of the peace." "Keep filming, Gabe," Caitlin yelled. Gabe swung the camera around. Now, the audience was watching the movie Kevin on the screen, while the real Kevin was physically wrestling with a piece of wood in the foreground. The projector beam hit the plywood, and for a moment, the image of Kevin's own face was projected onto his chest. He was literally wearing his own villainy. "Get off the sidewalk, Kevin!" someone from the crowd shouted. "We're trying to watch the show!" Kevin was frantic. He dropped the plywood and tried to stand directly in front of the lens, shadows of his flailing arms dancing across the screen like a giant, angry puppet. But the more he moved, the more ridiculous he looked. He was providing the perfect live ending to the documentary. "Look at the monitor, Dad," Gabe said, running over to me. On the small screen, the footage was incredible. It was a meta masterpiece. The film, the crowd, the angry HOA president, and the flashing lights of a distant police cruiser that Kevin had clearly called to the scene. "This is it," Caitlin said, her fingers flying over a tablet. "I'm live feeding the camera signal into the projector. Watch the screen." A second later, the projector image shifted. It was no longer the pre-recorded documentary. It was a live feed of Kevin standing right there in the street, looking confused and small. He was looking at himself being projected 40 feet wide, in real time, for the entire neighborhood to see. The police car pulled up, a real Fairview City officer, not an HOA guard. He stepped out, looked at the crowd on the public sidewalk, looked at the projector on the public street, and then looked at Kevin, who was currently throwing a tantrum in the middle of the road. "Sir," the officer said to Kevin over his loudspeaker, "please step out of the street. You are obstructing traffic." The crowd went wild. The villain was being told he was the obstruction. Gabe didn't stop. He filmed the officer's interaction. He filmed Kevin's silent, defeated walk back to his house. He filmed the end title card as it faded in over the live shot of Kevin's closing front door. That's the take, Gabe whispered, lowering the camera. That's the final frame. The morning after the driveway premiere felt like the first day after a fever breaks. The neighborhood was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the forced, aesthetic uniformity silence of Kevin's reign, but the peaceful, exhausted stillness of a place that had finally exhaled. I found Gabe and Caitlin in the kitchen at 8 a.m. They hadn't slept a wink. The kitchen island was a graveyard of empty energy drink cans, half-eaten donuts, and three different laptops hummed like jet engines as they rendered the final cut. The infinite loop version was complete. Gabe had spent the dawn hours stitching the live footage of Kevin's plywood meltdown and the arrival of the Fairview police into the climax of the film. It's already at 50,000 views, Gabe said, his voice raspy and thin. The local news picked up the live stream from last night. They're calling it the Battle of Pine Ridge. Look at the comments, Dad. People are sharing their own HOA horror stories from all over the country. Caitlin was leaning back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. We didn't just make a movie, Gabe. We started a digital archive of suburban angst. It's bigger than the assignment now. But the real ending didn't happen on a screen. It happened on our front porch just after noon. There was a knock, not the heavy, authoritative bang of a man with a clipboard, but a hesitant, almost rhythmic tap. I opened the door to find Mrs. Higgins, the HOA treasurer, standing there. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood two other board members. They weren't wearing their usual beige official sweaters or carrying leather-bound binders. They looked like people who had spent a very long night staring at their own reflections in a dark room. David, Mrs. Higgins said, her eyes casting down toward the blue painter's tape that was still stuck to the sidewalk, peeling at the edges. We held a vote this morning, an unofficial one, held in my living room. And? I asked, keeping my hand firmly on the doorframe. Kevin has been asked to take an indefinite leave of absence from the board, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The injunction against your property has been dropped, and we're revoking all the fines related to Gabriel's project. All of them. She looked past me into the foyer where Gabe was standing. He still had his camera in his hand, force of habit at this point. He didn't lift it to his eye. He just let it hang by his side. We saw the movie, Gabriel, Mrs. Higgins said softly, finally meeting his gaze. The part where we sat in that community center and let him threaten your family. We didn't realize how we looked until we saw it on that screen last night. We looked like shadows. We looked like people who had forgotten why we moved here in the first place. They left as quietly as they had arrived, walking down the driveway without checking the height of our grass or the color of our mulch. There was no victory parade, just a sense of profound suburban shame lifting off the street. The final shot of the experience came an hour later. Gabe and Caitlin walked down to the curb to pack up the last of the gear, the heavy cables, the battery packs, and the permanent press area sign. I stood on the porch, leaning against the railing, watching them work. Suddenly, Kevin's garage door rattled open. The sound made us all freeze for a second. Kevin came out to get his mail. He didn't have his notebook. He didn't have his measuring wheel. He was wearing an old, stained sweatshirt and looked like a man who had realized, quite suddenly, that the world didn't fit into his columns and rows anymore. He saw Gabe. For a long beat, the two of them just stared at each other across the 20 feet of asphalt that had been a battlefield for 2 weeks. I braced myself, wondering if Kevin had one last outburst left in him. Instead, Kevin looked at the camera lens, the glass eye that had dismantled his kingdom, and he simply turned his back. He didn't slam the door. He just retreated into the shadows of his house. Gabe didn't zoom in. He didn't chase the shot. He just let the frame hold the empty, quiet street for a long, cinematic beat. Is that the end? I asked as they walked back up the driveway, hauling the last equipment case. Gabe looked at the monitor, then at Caitlin, who gave him a tired, triumphant nod. He reached down and hit the power button. The little red light on the side of the camera flickered once and then went black. Yeah, Dad, Gabe said, a tired but real smile finally breaking across his face. That's the end. I think I'm ready to turn in my assignment now. As I watched them head into the house to finally collapse into sleep, I realized that Gabe hadn't just made a movie. He taught the neighborhood that while you can regulate the color of a house or the height of a hedge, you can't ever truly own the story that happens inside of it. I went to the kitchen, and finally, for the first time in weeks, I made a pot of coffee just for myself. No craft services for a crew, no Gonzo war room meetings. Just a quiet cup of coffee in a house that felt like a home again. Gabe got an A+. Plus. But more importantly, the blue tape on the sidewalk stayed there for a month, and nobody, not even the new board, dared to tell us to peel it up. And that's David's story. Once again, thank you for sticking around. If you enjoyed the story, consider subscribing. It's the best way to help a small channel like this get noticed by the algorithm. But now, I'll turn it over to you. What do you think David should have done? What would you have done if you were in his position? Comment below your thoughts, and I hope to see you in the next one.